Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week, we feature interviews with incredible poets and artists, including Olivia Gatwood and A.E. Stallings, and original poetry read by the authors. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas and Portraits of Red and Gray. Olivia Gatwood is an internationally recognized poet and author of Life of the Party and New American Best Friend. Her poetry performances and workshops, held at over 200 schools and universities, and videos online have reached millions of viewers. Olivia has also worked as a Title IX compliant educator in sexual assault prevention and recovery. I'm thrilled to welcome Olivia Gatwood to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Hi, James. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thanks for virtually meeting in my recording studio, also known as my closet.
Yeah, totally.
All right, well, I first read Life of the Party a couple of years ago. To prepare for this interview, I listened to the audiobook version while on a road trip to LA. It was so interesting hearing your poems performed and then going back to read them in your book. The Lover is Tapeworm is a good example, which is visualized as a concrete poem. How do you approach turning poems into performances, and how does performing a poem influence what you write?
You know, I think sometimes those two genres, spoken word and written word, are seen as two different mediums almost. And I think there's ways in which they can be. So certain poems require a performance, poems that use different elements of sound, poems that take on a certain persona and require a specific voice. But I think actually at its best, the two poems are two poems. One poem that's read both ways are kind of like functioning symbiotically and are experienced differently, but still just as, exciting and engaging in both forms. So what I do, how I approach it is, I'll just use some examples. Ode to Women on Long Island utilizes voice a lot. I'm doing an accent and I'm doing a persona. And so I struggled with how to translate that onto paper. And what I had to accept is that some amount of it was going to be lost. Not everyone knows what a Long Island accent sounds like. Not everyone knows how it can do one, right? So what I did instead is I made it clear that those parts where I do the voice of the women on Long Island were italicized and separated just to communicate to a reader that a different speaker is present. And then, Lover as a Tapeworm is very much a poem that exists on the page first and foremost because it's formatted in kind of the shape of a tapeworm. It's long, it's thin, there's 1 to 2 words on each line. And that was kind of me just being really playful. I also found myself, though, strangely enough, I wrote the poem in that form first. And then when I started to read it aloud, I would read it in that way too. I would kind of, like everything I put inside of myself, like I read it in this almost like, I don't know, this kind of like fall. I was like falling from line to line, sort of. So anyway, I think it's really valuable for us to understand that writing a poem and having it exist on the page and performing a poem offer different things, but no poem has to be exclusive to one form. It's just about recognizing that there's going to be things you lose and there's going to be things you gain in each form, and really trying to approach them differently and just figure out the best way for the poem to exist in that specific space.
Well, I certainly recommend for anyone who bought Life of a Party a few years ago, go and get the audiobook and listen to it, because that's a perfect way of articulating that they both communicate in distinct and complementary ways. Very cool. So Life of the Party starts with an author's note that is so much more than a note. It's an essay on violence against women, the biased lens of true crime, and the shared fear that both instill. You weave in the tragic stories of a babysitter and Eileen Wuornos into your book. How did you approach editing your poems into a cohesive narrative, which I think you've done more so than many of the poetry books I've read recently, which are more collections.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that order is very important to me. I think because I have always felt more like a storyteller than anything else. I feel like and when I say that, I don't mean necessarily a storyteller like that, like as a, necessarily that's like my profession or my medium, but I think of things in stories. I think of memories very chronologically. I think of my life very chronologically. I always am thinking of what led to what. And so I think that's kind of just how my brain works. But additionally, when I was writing this book, maybe because of that, and also because of the nature of the content, I really had to go back into my life and kind of go on an investigative journey about my relationship to fear, my relationship to this genre, what parts of my fear were a product of media and what parts of my fear were a product of my own life. So I did have to go back to the beginning. And I think it's valuable for any writer to think about how best to, any poet especially, to think about how best to unfold their poems, because poems they can totally be sporadic. Like, you absolutely don't need to order poems in a certain way. But I do think it's a fun challenge, because I think sometimes people assume poetry collections don't need that, or poetry collections don't require that. And I actually think laying out your poems can in some ways honor the project in a way that maybe poets don't always get credit for, in a way that novelists do. And so anyway, I was writing pretty chronologically already, but then I went, and what many poets do when they're ordering their poems is they print them out and they lay them out in like a tiled floor. That ended up being kind of too big, and so I put the titles on Post-it notes and put them up on my wall. And then I could just kind of play, rearrange them. And every day I would look at it and be like, oh no, that poem shouldn't go there, because it was about chronology. But then it was also about what poem was leading into the next, like what it sounded like and what a reader's experience was. And am I kind of like hitting a reader over the head too much with this idea, and maybe I need to relieve them a little bit, maybe I need to like give them some light, maybe I need to leave them on a note of hope. And so yeah, it's I think a really worthwhile process for poets to consider, poets who don't do that.
It's for my first book that no one was really giving me direction. And I started doing it in a big Google Doc, and it was just totally unworkable. I just couldn't see everything. And you have to physically print it out. And then I had them on my family room floor for like a week, where I was just moving them around and putting placeholders and figuring out what am I number sections are called. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I've talked to several poets who have done that. So, and actually you kind of answered my next question, but I'll just bring it out a little bit. So, there are moments that are exquisitely beautiful, such as Girl, moments that are raw and unflinching, like Ode to My Bitch Face, moments of humor. You mentioned Ode to the Women on Long Island, moments that are brutal, like Body Count 13 and Man's Laughter or Manslaughter. And you kind of touched on this. How did you, maybe to go a little deeper, how did you know you were getting the balance right between, hitting the reader over the head and giving them a chance to take a breath?
I think that ultimately I had to touch base with myself, because I can't know exactly you can't make yourself write a poem, just for the sake of digestibility. I mean, I guess you can, but you're probably not going to write the best poem. I think for my own self-care, I had to start writing some lighter poems, because Life of the Party is very heavy, and it's a lot heavier than it's definitely a snapshot into a really kind of difficult time in my life. It was really hard to write that book, and I was already in kind of a dark place, and then writing that book thrust me, like any writer. I was suddenly just swallowed by the world of true crime, because I was kind of researching it now, and I was reading it even more than I did before, and I was thinking about it so critically, and so I think that I started to have to be really aware of how I felt when I was experiencing the book. I saw something recently that was a little, made me a little nervous, but was, I think, the tough love I needed to hear, which was like, if you are reading back a part of your book and you're feeling bored, it's not because you've read it a million times. It's because it's boring.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't totally agree with that. I do think, I'm writing a novel right now and I've probably read it over 200 times. I do think my experience of the novel is probably different than a first-time reader. But I also think there's no harm in holding yourself to that standard. And because it's really invigorating, no matter how many times you've read something you wrote, if it's really good, reading it again always feels good. So anyway, I kind of had to have that same process with the book where it was like, all right, if I'm reading this and feeling like, fuck, this is like hard and heavy, like maybe I owe that to myself. Maybe I need that moment of lightness. So, it was helpful it was kind of it was healthy for me to do that.
So after performances, which I saw you in Berkeley, it was fabulous. You were very generous and spent time with your audience. What have you learned from readers who have been affected by the themes you write about in your poetry? And I'll give you a personal example is when I was writing my book, I had read your book recently, and it brought back, I thought of some memories that I had, particularly one where I was mugged at the age of 10 by a gang of like 12 kids, empty subway station, hand over my mouth, about to be pulled down the stairs, and then let go by somebody spooking them. And I'm not really sure who, because it's kind of I really don't remember very much after it happened. I remember everything up to the point where it happened. And then the rest is a bit of a blur. So writing that poem was super hard because I had to relive the experience, but it was very helpful to relive, get it out of me and onto paper. So what have you, so that was my experience, like kind of taking inspiration from your approach, but what have you heard from other readers and listeners?
I think it's something really similar. I think there's a way that writing the poem releases something from you. And it doesn't mean that that thing is gone, as you know, but I do think being able to verbalize something helps you understand it. And I think when you understand something, it becomes less scary, or you have maybe a more distant relationship to it. So my therapist describes trauma as an event that is over, but your brain hasn't told you it's ended. So your brain has convinced you that it's still happening. And I thought that was like a really simple and beautiful way of describing it. And I think sometimes writing the poem can teach your brain that it's ended, while you're writing the poem, ironically, while you're writing it, it's happening. While you're writing it, you're in it again. And you're like, oh my God, like you're absolutely, but you kind of have to rerun through it. And then it's there on this piece of paper. And it's like, wow, yeah, that event is a part of my past now. And so I think that the book functioned that way for me, for sure. When I finished it and I was able to kind of move on from that time in my life. And I've heard similar things from readers that either reading the poems or writing the poems themselves. And often people will read the poems and then write their own poems, like you said. And I think that's I think the feeling of fear and the feeling and the experience of violence is so common and universal. And so many people, no matter how different their experiences were, have such a similar emotional reaction. I think it pulls really similar things from us. So, yeah.
Yeah. So again, I saw you perform in Berkeley, and the audience was just this lean in attentiveness. There was a pin drop. Like everyone was collectively not wanting to miss a word, except when they were given permission to laugh, which there were several times. So how did you develop the skill of holding an audience's attention? Because I don't think we're born with it. This is a skill. And what mistakes helped you find your voice?
That's a good question. The Berkeley show was so amazing. And that is one element of performing that can be really exciting and also really hard is your audience matters. It does. I mean, an expert performer will perform the same no matter what. But when you feel good and when something's being given back to you, it becomes more of a conversation. It's just good to be validated. It's scary to get on stage. And when you feel like no one's there, you feel like people aren't listening, or you feel like they don't get it, like that, I mean, that would affect anyone. So not for nothing, the Berkeley audience was particularly engaging and excited and funny and attentive. And so that contributes. But I was not a public speaker. I was not a stage child. I was very shy for a long time, very self-conscious. I was an athlete. I was not a performer in any way. And then when I started writing poetry, it just felt so instinctual to read it aloud. It wasn't that I wanted to be on a stage. It wasn't that I wanted people to listen to me. It was like I have to read this aloud because there's a way it needs to be read, and if I'm not the one reading it, then it's going to be read wrong, which I also had to let go of when I started writing books, but that's what prompted it. And so I have been performing poetry since I was 16, and so over the years it became kind of just a matter of practice, of getting on as many stages as possible, getting comfortable with the sound of your own voice, getting comfortable with your breathing patterns, understanding, reading your poems aloud to yourself as much as you can. I used to read them aloud to myself in the shower and when I was driving, just to like memorize them like songs. But then when I really started to hone in on it, on especially like improvising and holding an audience throughout a show, was when I started speaking at college campuses doing lectures, because I had to think on my feet. And I think the two biggest things is honestly, like faking it until you make it. I think when you asked about mistakes, like my biggest mistake has been feeling those nerves and then letting them just take over my body. And instead recognizing what looks like fear. So your head is down, your voice is quiet, all those things, and just not doing them. Like, even if you're feeling it, it's like, lift up your head, raise your voice, use your hands. It's a dance, it's a performance. And so I think realizing that, because I actually do have stage fright, but I realize so much of what makes stage fright worse is when we show it. And so I think over the years, I've learned the kind of the signs of stage fright and how to hide them. And I think the second thing is trusting yourself. I think with improvising, that's really important. I think recognizing that knowing that you know the answer, you are an expert in this topic. That's why you're here. That's why you're up here speaking about it, because you understand it. And just answering the question, even if there's not an actual question being asked, just showing up for the assignment, and really trusting yourself, not worrying about, what the right answer is, what people want to hear, but having a conversation with the audience. And I think that can be worked on, honestly, by talking to yourself. I talk to myself all the time. I talk to myself while I'm driving. I rehearse conversations because I have social anxiety, and I need to know, I need to know that I know what to say. So anyway, I think that's kind of an all over the place answer, but
oh no, that was wonderful. There's so many things I'm going to pull away. Actually, after seeing you perform, and then I'd written poetry for so many years, but never really performed. It's like, I have to overcome this. This is I in my work life, I present to executives and stuff all the time. That's fine. I get nervous in an appropriate way, but I felt self-conscious, and I'm like, all right, that's my goal. And I know that she didn't start at that level. Like, she worked her way up. And then I actually worked with a friend of my older daughter's who was an MFA. He ended up being, he does poetry reciting competitions. And so I hired him to be my poetry coach.
Oh, cool.
And
well, that's a big one. Is I've had many coaches, and those are so helpful.
It's just so, because it's a safe space, just two people, and he knows, he's already gotten to that skill level anyway. So that was really,
totally.
really
a coach
helpful.
Is so valuable, and also improv classes, theater classes, like any open mics, like any opportunity you can get to practice around people who are also practicing, it just makes a huge difference.
Yeah, the one there's not a lot of benefits to the pandemic. One little benefit is the open mics are all virtual. So I've been dropping into open mics all over the country just to force myself to get out there. So
yeah.
So sometimes when I'm writing, in particular when I'm in love with an idea, I'll step back and question if I found the poetry in the idea. Your poem, If a Girl Screams in the Middle of the Night, has such a powerful idea with beautiful passages like this. And I apologize, I'm going to read a little passage.
No, that's okay.
If she is face down in the moss, it seeps into the forest's floor's pores. And every time a hiker passes through, the days beyond her unravel. and steps along the sponge green floor, a small howl will fan out from beneath his feet. It's just beautiful. But anyways, what is your approach to finding the poetry in an idea that you're in love with?
So I think letting with that poem was actually really different for me because it's kind of surrealist, and I don't think I let myself lean into surrealism enough in my life as a poet, because I was always taught that everything needed to be kind of like very serious and autobiographical. And I still love autobiographical poetry. I love poetry, conversely, that is really straightforward and tells a very simple story. But I think, well, this is kind of a two-part answer, but for that poem in particular, it was letting myself have an imagination and really go there and kind of imagine this whole, just keep taking it step by step, because I'd had this little idea that I think could have been, I guess what it is it could have been just a metaphor. Like I could have said, or it could have been written as like a simile, like, this, like her, instead of literally saying that her scream was sold to a thrift store and sent to a landfill, I could have not done that so literally and instead, made it clear that I was doing a simile or whatever. But instead what I did is I lived into it as if it was an actual story. And I think that is an encouraging practice, to just challenge yourself as a poet to like move away from being like, this thing is like this other thing, and instead just being like, no, this thing is this, and pushing people to have that imagination, pushing people to get weird, pushing people to dive into, to just strange fictional stories. But I think additionally, in general, the way that I know that there's poetry in something is when I just can't stop thinking about it. When a memory is nagging at me, when a story is one that won't leave me, I recognize, oh, there's something here. And then the way that I approach that is by really diving into the sensory experience of that thing. Because usually for me, that's where the poetry is. I try to build out the scene in a sensory way. I don't know. I'd have to think. That's a complicated answer. Again, that's a good question, but I haven't rehearsed it to myself yet.
So just one more thing. So I'm waiting for your novel in anticipation, as I know many of your readers are, of cracking the spine for the first page. And I'm really curious how poetry has influenced your prose. And I'm thinking in particular about a writer I love, Canadian author and poet Michael Ondaatje. He writes very challenging poetry, very beautiful poetry. And his novels are challenging too, but they're clearly influenced by his ability as a poet. So are poetic devices finding their way into your prose?
100%. This novel has been the hardest thing I've ever written, because I realized one thing poetry doesn't teach you is how to finish a sentence. So finishing sentences and like getting like transitions are the hardest. I'm like, wait, I have to explain how this person like went to the bathroom. Like, that's so boring. Like, how do I make that interesting? Something I've learned is in a lot of novels I've been reading that aren't written by poets, those lines are, the author has accepted that those lines are boring. But my favorite novels are the ones where there are no boring lines. There's every line, and it's not necessarily flowery and over the top, but that every word feels really considered, which I think is something you learn in poetry. So often poets are my favorite novelists. I love when poets write novels. So my novel 100% has poetic devices. I don't know how to think without thinking in simile and metaphor. I don't know how to describe things without describing it, in that sensory way. And so hopefully, that resonates with people, but that's the only way I know how to write.
So Olivia, thank you so much for taking a few minutes from your day away from your writing and all the other things you're working on to share your time with the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast. It's been a thrill talking to you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck on your writing.
All right, thank you. The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Twitter @Dublin Ranch, subscribe to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and to follow us on viewlesswings.com or on Instagram at viewlesswings.